In the summer of 1965, the sunlight in Sacramento was relentless. Not the soft, golden glow of nostalgia, but a harsh, bleaching glare that peeled paint from wooden fences and crisped maple leaves on the sidewalks. In a suburban neighborhood of identical houses, with manicured lawns and cars gleaming in driveways, Margaret Thompson lived a life she believed was set in stone. She was 32, with 2 children, a 9-year-old boy named Danny, and a 6-year-old girl named Sarah, and a husband named Walter, who worked at the tax office, leaving at 8 in the morning and returning at 5:30 in the evening. Never earlier, never later. Their life was a series of tidy routines, like the canned goods, neatly stacked in Margaret's kitchen pantry. Next door lived a man named Ray. Ray was not like Walter. Ray kept no fixed hours. He was a mechanic, working in a small garage at the back of his lot, where the smell of motor oil and metal mingled with cigarette smoke. He had dark, unruly hair and eyes the color of sagebrush, not the green of oceans but of weeds pushing through cracks in concrete. Ray had no wife, no children, and he lived in the house his mother had left him, a small place with faded yellow curtains. Margaret never thought she'd notice Ray, but she did, and that changed everything. Margaret couldn't pinpoint the exact moment she began to see Ray. Perhaps it was a June afternoon, when she was hanging laundry in the backyard, and Ray emerged from his garage, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. He looked at her and smiled. Not the polite smile of a neighbor, but the smile of someone who knew something she didn't. "Nice day, isn't it, Margaret?" he said, and she nodded, feeling a jolt run down her spine, not from the summer heat, but from the way he said her name, like it was a secret they both held. From there, the moments piled up. One morning, Ray brought over a basket of tomatoes from his garden, leaving them on her porch with a note, "For Margaret, from Ray." She kept the note, tucked it in the drawer of her vanity beneath the handkerchiefs she never used. Another afternoon, when Danny's baseball rolled over the fence, Ray tossed it back, but his eyes lingered on Margaret, standing at the kitchen window, hands still slick with dish soap. She began to anticipate these moments, these fleeting encounters, these offhand words. She began to live for them. Walter didn't notice. Walter wasn't the kind of man who noticed small shifts. He liked things in their place, on time. He liked dinner on the table at 6, his coffee black, and the family story told neatly, without any skipped beats. Margaret used to think she liked that too. But when Ray came into her orbit, she started to feel the gaps in her life, gaps she hadn't known were there. They weren't chasms or voids, but fine cracks, like the hairline fractures in a porcelain vase, still functional but no longer flawless. That fall, Margaret started finding reasons to see Ray. She brought him cookies, claiming she'd baked too many and didn't want them to go to waste. She asked if he could fix Danny's bicycle, though it wasn't broken. She lingered longer than necessary by the fence, talking about nothing important, the weather, the garden, the hum of the nearby freeway. Ray always responded, not too eagerly, but enough to make her feel seen, not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a woman. One evening, when Walter was working late and the kids were asleep, Margaret stepped into the backyard, pretending to check the clothesline. Ray was there, sitting on an old folding chair, smoking and staring at the sky. He invited her to sit, and she did, though she knew she shouldn't. They talked about small things at first, then deeper about dreams that never took shape, about places they'd never seen, about the feeling of being trapped in a life that no longer fit. When he touched her hand, just a light brush, she didn't pull away. She felt like she was falling, not downward, but into a place she'd forgotten existed. Their affair lasted 3 months. Not the fiery romance of novels, but a series of stolen moments, hurried meetings in Ray's garage or in his truck, parked on a quiet side street. Margaret knew it was wrong. She knew it every time she looked into Sarah's eyes, every time she folded Walter's shirts, every time she sat in church on Sunday mornings and heard the preacher talk about fidelity. But she couldn't stop. Ray was the only thing that made her feel alive, as if she'd been asleep for a decade and was just now waking up. But secrets, like cracks in pavement, eventually show through. A neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, saw Margaret leaving Ray's garage one late afternoon. her dress slightly wrinkled, her hair mussed. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't one to stay quiet. The whispers spread, quick and sharp, like a brush fire in dry grass. Walter heard the rumors from a co-worker, who heard it from a friend, who heard it from Mrs. Jenkins. He confronted Margaret one night, after the kids were in bed, his voice calm but cold, like a winter wind. "Is it true?" he asked, and she couldn't lie. She told him everything, not because she wanted absolution, but because she was too tired to keep pretending. Walter didn't yell, he didn't break anything. He just looked at her, as if she were a stranger, and left the house. He didn't come back for 3 days. When he did, he told her he wanted a divorce. He would keep the kids, because he didn't trust her to care for them. Margaret didn't argue. She felt she'd lost the right to Dot. Margaret left the Sacramento house in the spring of 1966, carrying a suitcase with a few clothes and a photograph of Danny and Sarah. She moved to a small apartment in Oakland, a place that smelled of mildew and had walls so thin she could hear her neighbors' arguments. She found a job as a secretary in a law office, typing 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. She didn't reach out to Ray. He'd left the neighborhood soon after the affair came to light, and she didn't know where he'd gone. She didn't try to find out. Part of her knew Ray wasn't the real cause of the collapse. He was just the spark that exposed what had already been breaking. Those first years in Oakland were a blur of long days and sleepless nights. Margaret wrote letters to Danny and Sarah, but Walter rarely let them reach the children. When she called, he answered with a polite but distant tone, as if she were an old acquaintance he no longer cared to know. She didn't blame him. She only blamed herself, not for loving Ray, but for letting that love destroy what she'd had. Began to rebuild, not because she wanted to prove anything, but because she had no other choice. She learned to cook for one, to savor quiet mornings with a cup of coffee and a book. She joined a book club at the local library, where she met other women trying to piece themselves back together after their own losses. She didn't share her story, but she listened, and in their stories, she found fragments of her own. Years passed, and Margaret became someone else, not better or worse, just different. She became the grandmother Danny and Sarah, now grown, occasionally visited. They didn't talk about what happened, but she felt the distance in their eyes, a gap she knew she couldn't close. She lived alone, but not entirely lonely. She had new routines, small joys, a tiny garden on her balcony, evenings with old jazz records, letters she wrote but never sent. Looking back, Margaret didn't regret Ray, nor did she regret what she'd lost. She only regretted how she'd let it all crumble, the moments she could have chosen differently. But she also knew that, in the cracks of her life, she'd found something, not redemption, not forgiveness, but a kind of freedom, fragile but real. And so she carried on, alone, in her small Oakland apartment, with the summer sun still as harsh as it was in 1965, but now she'd learned to stand beneath it without burning.